So I'm really excited that my Dr. Hruschka's paper is finally out in the Journal of Cognition and Culture. It's been submitted about 2 years ago, so it's been a little bit of a wait. And this is my work in Ukraine and United States in 2013 and 14 based on surveys. So I wanted to give a very quick 5-minute overview of what it is that we did in case you don't feel like reading it. So in 2013, back then, I was doing some interviews on health eating perceptions. And I was really interested in how people blame different foods for health outcomes, both in Eastern Europe, or mainly Ukraine, and United States, mainly Phoenix metropolitan area. I noticed in those interviews that my Ukrainian participants would talk more about how you should eat the food versus what you eat. So they'd mention more things like the time of eating, how you pattern your meals, the mental state when you're eating, things like that. I called it eating context. And I contrast that to statements about eating content or the actual food choice or what kinds of foods you should eat and so on. Anyway, I wanted to check if Eastern Europeans indeed endorse those kinds of statements, the statements on eating context, more than Americans. So I did a survey, about 45 people each, not huge, that showed that yes, Eastern Europeans did endorse statements about eating context more than Americans. And the question we had was why? Of course, some people might endorse eating context more than others. We knew that being Ukrainian seems to predict higher endorsement of context, but we were thinking there might be something that would explain that. And just before I go on, let me show you the kinds of statements we used. So examples of eating context would be like, always eat breakfast, don't eat in front of the TV, stop eating protein late in the day. So things about how you eat. And food content statements would be things like reduce food high in sugar, eat more fish. So things about the food choice itself. So we're thinking, what could account for differences in people or perhaps cultures? And one of the things we examined was levels of collectivism. It's a key dimension in psychology along which cultures differ, and it is basically showing you the perceived relationship between yourself and others in society. So more collectivist cultures would be more thinking in terms of being part of a group. More importantly, collectivist cultures hold a more holistic pattern of attention, which means that they notice more features of context or the field as a whole versus a central focal item. So for example, if you show this photo for a second to somebody in a more collectivist cultures, they'll remember more details about the environment the fish was in. If you show it to a much more individualistic, less collectivist individual, they'll remember more about the focal object, the fish itself. Anyway, our hypothesis was somebody from a more collectivist society will hold a more holistic pattern of attention, thus emphasize context more, and focus on eating context more, specifically in the domain of nutrition. Sorry, you can see that because of my face. So how did we do that? We have surveys, again in 2014, where we people have to read a bunch of statements. Some of them are about context, some of them about content, both make up scales, and they rate them on how important they are in this people's opinion for weight loss. We choose weight loss, that's the easiest for people to think about in terms of a health outcome. And we measure collectivism with the cultural orientation scale, 16 items there. Here are some examples. For example, this first one, it is my duty to take care of my family even when I have to sacrifice what I want, is an example of a collectivist worldview. And people rate how much this represents them on a 9-point scale. So what do we find out? Eastern Europeans do endorse context statements higher than Americans. Again, we replicate that. Eastern Europeans are also more collectivist, significantly more, and as you can see, the effect sizes are pretty large. So do Eastern Europeans endorse context more because they're more collectivist, though? And the answer is yes. We did an informal mediation analysis, and we saw that being Ukrainian is a significant predictor of higher collectivism, higher context scores. But once you account for collectivism, being Ukrainian is no longer statistically significant. So that means that nationality is not a significant predictor. And we controlled for other things like BMI, health consciousness levels, age, gender. Still, collectivism is the only significant predictor of higher endorsement. What does this tell us? That based on this work and our surveys, Eastern European participants endorse context of eating as more important for weight loss than American respondents, and these results are consistent with the statement that collectivist cultures pay more attention to context. So we argue that this holistic thinking pattern of collectivist societies appears to extend to the domain of food. And this is important because ideas about how you should eat can be quite crucial for weight management and other health outcomes. That's not actually part of my work, but you should really go to Google Scholar and look it up.